Welcome to the podcast, How to Be Well and Strong. I'm your host, Jacqueline Genova, and I'm excited to have you join me as I speak with some of the leading figures in the fields of wellness, integrative medicine, and mental health, as we discover what it truly means to be well and strong in both body and mind. Get ready to be empowered, inspired, and motivated about being an advocate for your own health. Welcome to today's episode on the How to Be Well and Strong podcast. I'm very excited for the conversation that is about to take place with Dr. Lauren Mathewson. We're going to be discussing the importance of maintaining a healthy internal terrain, including the impact it can have on our immune systems, digestion, mental health, and even the development of cancer. Dr. Mathewson has a passion for working with integrative oncology and autoimmune patients. She takes a broad treatment approach as she recognizes they are multifactorial diseases, and good health always comes back to healthy terrain. She loves working with nutrition, exercise, lifestyle, botanical medicines, supplements, environmental medicine, and stress management. Prior to attending medical school, Dr. Mathewson had a successful career in academic research, working in the fields of cancer and DNA repair, genetics, immunology, microbiology, pathology, and reproduction. When she's not practicing medicine, Dr. Mathewson tries to spend as much time outside in nature as possible. Dr. Mathewson, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
I'm so happy to have you.
Yeah, this is thrilling. Yeah.
This is a topic that I am very passionate about, as you know, particularly as our body's terrain can be either friendly or unfriendly to growing cancer cells and other common diseases. So I'm very excited just to pick your brain and share some truly what I think are life-changing insights with listeners.
Yeah, I'm delighted. I totally agree with you. So much of our health really just comes back to our fundamentals, kind of how well our body is working in the moment, and we can talk about that as our terrain. It's kind of I think of terrain in the same way that I think about a vineyard and things growing, right? We're looking at the soil quality, and we're looking at the air and the water and the temperature and the stressors in the local environment. And so as humans, we have our own internal terrain that I think the healthier we get our terrain, the healthier the rest of us is going to be.
Couldn't agree more. And I love that analogy. I've read a lot about this terrain-based approach to cancer, as I'm sure you are intimately familiar with from Dr. Winters, and the Terrain 10, which for our listeners are, the 10 main drivers of health or disease and all key elements that are critical to preventing and managing cancer. Some of these include, genetics, blood sugar balance, inflammation, toxic burden. Of those drivers, Dr. Mathewson, which in your opinion are the ones that should be prioritized? I know that's a bit of a hard question, but if we have a patient who's taking their first step, what are the three that we need to prioritize?
Jacqueline, I love it. You're throwing me a tough one right off the bat. Let's see. I agree. They're all so important, and they're going to vary kind of priority wise, patient by patient. But fundamentally, in my mind, sort of removing environmental burdens and removing the patient either from exposures to toxicants or whether that's, kind of nonsense in their diet, being exposed to pesticides through their foods, or, living in a house that's had major water damage and now we're in a moldy environment. I kind of think of that as being like, we're not going to make any progress while we're still in a kind of a sick situation, right? So that one, I think, and I know that's broad and that's not specifically one of the Train 10, but I would say removing obstacles to cure is so foundational. Blood sugar is so important, and nutrition and blood sugar is so important as well, right? So when we think of nutrition, it can really be, obviously nutrition is such a broad subject, but when I think of nutrition, I'm thinking about macronutrients and micronutrients. I'm thinking about, protein and healthy fats and B vitamins and sort of like the building blocks that make us well. But then another element to that is, sort of how much our blood sugar is swinging around. Are we eating things that cause these steady rises and then kind of hold us steady? with our blood sugar? Are we eating things that are causing these big swings and spikes? So I think blood sugar would be my second. So removing toxins, keeping blood sugar steady and regulated, I think is so important because that's a reflector of overall metabolic well-being and health. Let me think of a third one. As it applies to everyone, I would put stress management. And I think that can be different for everybody, right? So stress shows up in, as we know, all different forms and shapes and sizes. It's not something that it's realistic for us to think we're ever going to get away from. So it really kind of comes down to how are we managing it? And do we have good coping skills for managing stressors? Do we have poor coping skills? And what can we do to shift those poor skills into kind of healthier ones that are going to serve our longer purposes? That's what I can think of off the top of my head.
Those are great. I love those. Let's start from the top with toxins. Assuming someone has no idea that their home contains any type of toxin, be it, mold, VOCs, what are, I guess, one or two steps that someone could take to figure out if their home does in fact have a high toxic burden?
Gorgeous. Wonderful question. I would say the first and probably the easiest low-hanging fruit in terms of removing unnecessary nonsense from your home is having scented things in the house. Is this scented candles? Is this dryer sheets? Is this plug-in stuff? Those are all releasing benzene rings and volatile chemicals that not only I personally don't really like the odor of artificial things, but that's asking our liver to do this whole extra step of detoxing things that are, I would consider, totally unnecessary in our environment. We can also argue that these all those extra fragrances, as we know, we have some really sensitive patients, and those fragrances will trigger them right off. So that I think is just so easy right off the bat, going through looking at, again, not having a bunch of weird artificial fragrances, and then looking through our cleaning products and looking through the things that are touching our body and the things that are cleaning the plates that then we're putting food on that are going in our body. And that should all be that really kind of as natural and kind of as hippie-like as we can. Things like, not to promote any specific brands, but like Seventh Generation makes really nice cleaning products for the home that aren't laden with a bunch of unnecessary chemicals that are going to cause harm to our well-being and anyone else in our household. So it's a great area. In terms of things like molds and mycotoxins, this is a big part of my practice because so many people are exposed to molds and mycotoxins that kind of have no idea. I would say the first and easiest sort of lowest sort of screening is, are there any rooms in your house that smell funny or musty or moldy? Are there any places we've had known water damage that wasn't fully remediated or maybe wasn't remediated to the way that it could have been? The moldy, musty smell is every time anyone says, oh yeah, my basement or whatever, their garage, sure enough, we run their mycotoxin exposure and it always comes back through the roof. Now, the reason we care so much about molds and mycotoxins is they can have very strong influence on our immune system. Depending on which mold and which sort of little mycotoxin it's producing. And the mycotoxins are basically mold metabolites that are tiny, 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 smaller than any spore, and they move, right? So if we have water damage in one bathroom, well, it's not like we can shut the door and say, okay, our mold damage and our water damage and our mycotoxins are controlled. I mean, they're perfusing through the house, they're getting in our clothes, they're affecting the well-being of our animals and our pets. And they're treatable, right? So that's the good news. Again, the reason we care so much is because they can have very significant influences on our immune system. We make a specific anti-rejection drug that we use for folks who've had organ transplants, and we want to make sure that they have a medication to cool off their immune system so their body doesn't reject that new organ. We give them a drug derived from mycophenolic acid, which is specifically made from from molds. And I can't tell you, I go in and I test folks and they've got these elevated mycophenolic acid levels, and we go, well, this probably is a big part of the reason why you've been having all these weird health things for the last handful of years that we just kind of like couldn't quite sort. So actually testing your home for mold is a complicated. I don't feel like we have really great standards established yet. It's very dependent on kind of the mold testing company in your area. That can be tricky. I find it more reliable to test the patient for molds before I go in and I start testing their home. So if I have a suspicion that we have a mold exposure, I'm going to have that patient do a mycotoxin test. It's nice. It's just a little urine sample. We're going to send that off. If we don't find any mycotoxins present in that individual, we say, okay, we're confident that your home environment isn't the source of this. I've had folks buy used cars, and those used cars had been through a big water damage event, and now their new used car made them sick. So it's really interesting that kind of, as you know, that environmental medicine rabbit hole, we can fall down and spend days there. So
I completely hear you. Those are great action steps. Going back to the toxins with the Febreze and all those aerosols, I cringe every time I see one of those Febreze commercials. And in my mind, I'm just shouting endocrine disruptor, or as I'm walking down my apartment hallway and I see the Glade plugins, like my first instinct is to just unplug them. And it's sad because many people don't know, and particularly women, endocrine disruptors you have to be very, very careful with breast cancer development and a slew of other things. So
100%. I totally agree with you. Yeah, I try to go out of my way to not have to walk down the detergent aisle in the grocery store because those fumes, right? You're just like, oh, immediate nausea. This is so funny. I had this professor in medical school, and he was telling us, we were talking about environmental medicine, this kind of similar conversation, and he's saying something about he's asked his neighbor to please stop using dryer sheets, and the neighbor is still using them. So whenever he has to, this is my professor was saying, whenever he'd have to leave his house to get to his car in the morning, if he heard his neighbor's dryer going, he'd take a deep breath of air and then run to his car. I mean, that might have been a little overkill, right? But I get
it's probably something I would do.
Yeah, I totally understand holding your breath and not being exposed to that. So I try to not be that person that glares at folks wearing too much fragrance in public, or but it's just
Yep. There's a fine line. And I think too, like many people get overwhelmed, right, with this whole concept of, oh, I have to detoxify my entire home and lifestyle. But small steps, like just like you said, using non-toxic cleaner. I'm a huge fan of Branch Basics. I don't know if you've heard of them before. Very simple to use. There's like one concentrate that they give you. You can use it for dishwasher, cleaning your clothes, your floors, everything. It's so great. And then air quality too. I'm a huge fan of Air Doctor Pro. I think they're a great air filter if someone's concerned about, mold.
I love air filters. I've always got them going. Yeah, I love my air filters.
Again, just small steps that, people could take right now to start
ensuring. And it's even something where, and I have to come in and remind myself about this because, I like beauty I like to play with makeup. I like to mess around with that stuff, right? And then I have to stop and say, okay, my skin is my largest organ, and anything I put on my body, right? When I was kind of growing up, we had this idea. My impression was, oh, whatever you put on your skin stays on the outside, right? You're not absorbing through your skin. Well, that's not accurate. We absolutely are absorbing what we're putting on our bodies. So I try to remind myself, when I'm thinking about putting something on topically, I'm passing it through my mind. I'm like, would I eat this?
I love
if
that.
I would not eat it, then I probably shouldn't be putting it on because it's going to the same spot, right?
I couldn't agree more. And even too, when it comes to like acne medications or steroids that many teenagers put on their skin, that's absorbed right into your bloodstream. And you think that it's not that big of a deal if you apply something topically, but you're ingesting it. So definitely something to be aware of. Next, you had mentioned blood sugar. This is an area I am very fascinated with because, first of all, blood sugar imbalance affects everything, as you mentioned, from mental health to hormones to cancer, every area of our lives. And I think it's really interesting now that so many people are being made more aware of their own personal triggers and monitoring themselves with continuous glucose monitors, which I've done in the past too. So, what are some steps for people that you have to help ensure they're maintaining a stable blood sugar level throughout the day?
I love that. I love that. Um, yeah, isn't it so cool that we live in this time where we have things like continuous glucose monitors and we can get this real time data where it's like, I can't tell you how many folks have kind of come back to me and they've been like, well, you know how I told you I didn't think my blah, blah, blah was affecting my blood sugar. And that's not true. I wore my glucose monitor and sure enough. So I love that. In a really broad, big approach, kind of the conversation, if I'm having with a patient and we're new to nutrition and we're new to talking about kind of why we care about our blood sugar, an analogy I like is just to kind of think about our metabolism as a fire, right? So we're our energy source, we're a burning fire every day. And what do we want on that fire? We want the big, slow burning logs. We don't want little fast bursts of fuel, right? We want this long, steady, continuous, slow burn. And so when I think of kind of the big logs on our fire, that's going to be protein, that's going to be healthy fats, and that's going to be fibers. And those are going to be things like that are going to burn for hours. They're not going to cause these big blood sugar spikes, and they're going to hold us steady. And then when we start thinking about things like complex carbohydrates, like brown rice and black beans and things that have some carbs, but they also have some fiber, I'm thinking that that's more of kind of a kindling where it's going to burn faster. It's not going to burn as long. And then when we shift over into the real starchy things and the sugars, well, there's our gasoline, there's our kerosene on the fire, where we have this, blood sugar surge, this spike of blood sugar. And then our body has to come in and put out a bunch of insulin to bring that blood sugar down. And what we're doing is insulin is pulling blood sugar out of circulation, storing it as fat in the cells. So now we've got this blood sugar drop about an hour and a half after we've eaten something that's very carby and starchy, and as you and I know, people feel lousy when their blood sugar is going wild. We have headaches, and culturally, we kind of talk about this as though it's sort of a funny thing. Like, oh, there's all these Snickers commercials, like so-and-so is a jerk when they're hangry, and just give them a Snickers and then they're kind of back to themselves. And it's like, well, yeah, but we should all have the metabolic flexibility. Our goal is that none of us should be getting hangry, right? None of us should be our metabolism should be able to switch between burning glucose and burning sugars and burning fats as fuels, right? We want to be, I know I'm going all over the place, but it does tie together. We want to be more of a hybrid vehicle than we want to be just like a gas sugar burning vehicle. We need to be able to burn different fuel sources. So when people say, oh, I can't go more than a couple hours without eating, I get hungry, I get so mad, I get cranky. In my mind, I'm going, oh, you're not metabolically flexible, right? Your body is so used to only burning sugar and only burning carbs that when you don't have a carb source, your body crashes out and it is not able to shift over and start burning fats as a fuel source, which is what we want, right? Because humans, we are not adapted to be eating 24 hours a day. We are evolutionarily, as mammals on this planet, there was not a 7-Eleven on every corner store, right? So humans are meant to have a big meal and then fast for a while. And that fasting is when our body is able to kind of process everything we've eaten, store it away. This constantly fed state keeps us in this metabolic sort of pre-diabetic. We're not managing our nutrients very well when we're having, again, constantly fed, constantly overfed, and overfed with sugars specifically. That's where we see those real blood sugar bounces. And that's where we see the origins of a lot of disease and disorder come from.
I'm so glad you touched on that. And I'd love to have a separate episode just on fasting. I myself try to restrict my feeding window between 6 to 8 hours a day and not go past that. Depends upon, certain times, but that's my ideal eating window.
Yeah.
One other question for you though. So obviously nutrition plays a huge factor in blood sugar levels. But I have heard of situations, and I actually have a family member with this, where her fasting glucose levels have remained elevated despite having a ketotarian diet, low carb, no sugar. How does one explain that? And to what effect do genetics play a role in that? So, my grandfather had diabetes. How can
Yeah.
we figure out
Yeah.
where is this high blood sugar coming from when her diet is predominantly one that wouldn't
Yeah.
necessarily cause that?
Beautiful question. And I do see this. It's not uncommon to see it all. My very first question would be, what's going on in her life, and what are her other sort of stressors? Is there anything that is keeping her anxiety kind of ramped up, keeping her concerned or worried? We know that anxiety and being stressed raises cortisol. Cortisol raises blood sugar. And I see this in people's lab work all the time where, they will be following a low carb Mediterranean style. They'll be doing their intermittent fasting. And I get their labs back and it goes, well, yeah, your blood sugar is elevated. Like why, what's happening here? Right. And I'll see their diet diaries and they'll upload all their information, their ketone monitors and their glucose monitors. And sometimes we just see these persistently elevated blood sugar levels. And I've found mind body medicine can be really helpful in moments like that, whether it's something like introducing a little bit of guided meditation or hypnotherapy or breath work, or lots of ideas to play in there. If we need more support, we can always come on board with something like a botanical blood sugar support. Berberine is really nice for that. But I'm more interested in figuring out, like, why is this not responding the way we want it to? As our first question. And then we've got lots of great tools to help manage. I'm also thinking, gosh, is there a mold exposure in this home, right? Because we know that different mycotoxins can keep the metabolism kind of cranked up and cortisol cranked up in a way that can have that ongoing effect on blood sugar. In patients that, in my mind, it is a high priority, we say, okay, I really want them to be receiving the health benefits of being in a ketogenic state. Even if we're struggling to get there with nutrition and with fasting, that would be a time where I'd talk about bringing on board some exogenous ketones, right? Just to push that individual kind of, in a sense, coax their metabolism to kind of shifting more into that ketogenic state, not knowing, we might not need to keep those exogenous ketones on board for forever. We might just a month or two, see if that kind of helps us.
We kind of touched on that third topic of stress management. And I also just wanted to insert in here a very important point that I've recently discovered, that the state in which we eat our food, meaning our mental and emotional state, will actually impact our body's ability to extract the nutritional value from that food and feed it to our cells, which is why it's critical to also ensure, just like you said, you're in a peaceful and mindful state when eating, not just shoving food down your mouth or trying to suppress emotions with food. So with that, do you have any tips for our emotional eaters out there?
Ooh, that's such a good, juicy, brilliant question. Miss Jacqueline, we could spend days just on that conversation right there. First off, you are so right. We have studies that show that folks, we can take the same individual, we can give them the same meal, and depending on their emotional state, whether they're calm and relaxed and happy, or let's say they just got a bunch of work emails and they're behind, and not only are they going to be able to digest and absorb different nutrient profiles from that same meal based on their emotional state, they're also going to have different sort of immunologic responses to those meals. So the folks that are calm and relaxed are not going to they're less likely to mount a sensitivity to the foods that they're eating. So their body, not only is it absorbing and taking in and using, they're less likely to be a little bit reactive. But that's incredible, right? So I also kind of wonder if, we have all those years and years of data talking about like, oh, the Europeans have so much on us when it comes to meal times, right? And we are always kind of talking about like, oh, the French and their heart health, and they drink wine with dinner and all this. And we kind of start breaking down like, what is it about this European lifestyle that is contributing, to this idea? I think it's this sitting down and spending meals with your friends and family, and you're relaxed and you're laughing and you're enjoying yourselves. And yeah, you might be sipping little glasses of wine here and there, but our studies are coming out showing it's actually not the alcohol or the red wine that's beneficial at all, right? We think it's the community that's so beneficial. So I agree with you. In an ideal world, we would all have time in our days to sit down with all our aunties and eat a homegrown prepared meal. In the real world, that's probably not really happening. So what can we do to ensure that even when we're on a kind of our busy go, go, go lives, we're still setting ourselves up to have this optimal sense of digestion? A few really easy things, and I just love this question. So first of all, the most important thing that kind of clicks our body into we're going to be getting food is if we can smell something while it's cooking. If we can smell our food. That's why we always say sort of like, oh, you digest better when you eat a warm meal. It's not literally that the food is easier to digest when it's warm. It's that if it's warm, you've smelled it and you've kicked in this cephalic phase of digestion that starts going a few minutes before we eat, triggers all these hormones that our brain releases to tell our stomach start making gastric acid, start making digestive juices. So if we have the option to get a whiff of something that smells good, that's going to be really nice. It sort of sets the stage for our body. Other thing we can do just when we sit down to a meal, pause and take some deep belly breaths, right? 10, 15 deep belly breaths where, we can do our box breathing where it's in 4, hold 4, out 4, hold 4. And that does a really good job of kind of calming, regulating that we're inhaling as long as we're exhaling. It just matters that we literally take a moment and we're calming ourselves and we're breathing in a relaxed state. That's going to kick us over into this parasympathetic state where we're going to have a better chance to digest and absorb our foods. And then also, again, I'm coming back around to email. Don't be working on emails while we're eating. Take a break. Take that 5, 10, 15 minutes, listen to music, do something, it doesn't matter if you're going to be at your desk, watch puppy videos. Just do something that's not work, right? Keep our body out of that apprehension, anxiety state while we're eating our food.
I love that. I've made it a point myself to remove any screens when I'm eating, even my phone. I will just sit outside on my balcony. I will look up, activate my parasympathetic state, and just relax for that 20 minutes or so. And it has been such a game changer.
I love your discipline. Doesn't it make such a difference too? And I think that it's easy to fall into this state where it's like, oh, we have to constantly be entertained or constantly be busy or constantly doing stuff. And taking 15, 20 minutes, sit on your balcony with a meal and just look around outside. So good for your nervous system. Other thing I was going to say super quickly is I ask my patients to not drink a ton of icy cold beverages while they're eating, right? Because we're just diluting our gastric acid. And especially if we're drinking things that have ice in them, it's like, oh, we're just making it so much harder for digestion to occur in the stomach. So I really ask folks to little sips of water around meals are fine, but we don't need to be chugging, 1 liter of ice water right as we're eating. That's just going to make everything so much harder. And that's kind of an old, I learned that from my roommate in medical school. He was Korean and he was like, we always have just little sips of warm tea, or there's no cold beverages on the table during meals. So that was a really good pointer.
I love that. Those are so helpful. I'm very excited for listeners to hear all of this because, again, life-changing insights right here. You touched on it before, or rather, I think we touched on this outside of the podcast recording, but what are your thoughts on the most optimal diet to maintain a healthy terrain? And obviously, as an oncologist, I'm sure this is going to also apply to cancer patients as well.
Isn't it so interesting? And you see this being in the nutritional field, where it's like, there are so many different diets out there, and it can be really overwhelming, I think, to the patient and the end consumer. I see all the time, and I will say, I don't think there is any one diet that is right for everybody, but I think there are some foundations that we can all share that 100% are appropriate for all of us, which are things like, try to not eat extra poison and toxins in your food, right? Try to eat organic as much as you can. And if it is a challenge, or we need to prioritize, or we need to look at our budget and say, what can we afford to eat organic versus non, then make sure that your animal products are organic, your dairy, your eggs, your meats, right? That's where it really matters so critically to be important, because animals do biological amplification. So, right, it's different. So there's my little soapbox on that. We're going to try to eat organic. I think that's really foundational. And we're going to try to eat in an anti-inflammatory way. And that is different individual by individual, what's going to set them off. But for the most part, anti-inflammatory diets are going to be low in white sugars. It's going to be minimal in processed foods, and it's going to have a ton of vegetables, a ton of healthy fats. So I would say a Mediterranean style diet generally fits all of those parameters. And it's funny and interesting because even though I just got through saying there are so many different ideas of nutrition and how to eat and what people should be doing, but in the medical community, the one diet we can pretty much all agree on is the Mediterranean diet, right? You can ask the most square cardiologist out to, the most kind of chanting and crystal, and everyone goes, yeah, Mediterranean diet. People do well on that. People feel good. We see fewer long-term health complications. We see fewer rates of disease, cancer, blah, blah, blah. And so then we kind of say, okay, well, what is it about the Mediterranean diet that is so remarkable? And certainly it has a lot of the foundations we kind of chatted about, right? The emphasis is on vegetables. The emphasis is on particularly kind of leafy greens. And we can think about the sort of things that would have been growing in gardens in the Mediterranean, right? So what are farmers in Greece eating 100 years ago? Well, they're eating what they're growing right there in their soil. They've got a ton of olives, right? So they're eating olives with meals, using a lot of olive oil. The ocean is right there. So there's some seafood, and there's small amounts of red meat, not crazy big amounts. And the red meat that they're eating is local and it's organic, right? So it's their neighbor raised that goat or whatever, and so we say, well, this is really, this gorgeous, interesting diet, kind of low in whole grains, but certainly there are some, right? So there's room for carbohydrates and grains in here. And then, so we start kind of digging in and saying, what is it about the Mediterranean diet that seems to be so remarkable for folks? And I think kind of what it's looking like in the research is that it's the olive oil is where so much of that magic is that olive oil is one of the only dietary oils that we eat that truly is an anti-inflammatory oil. We have other sort of more omega-3 based unsaturated oils that we think are decent for us. They're pretty good for us. We like avocado oil and we use coconut oil, but olive oil really seems to be remarkable. And what it's looking like is that olive oil, it is how it interacts in our gut, and that it does not it doesn't do this lipid raft thing that a lot of our other dietary oils do, in which they'll take some of the bacteria from our intestine and transport it into our body. Olive oil doesn't do that. So it's, I think that's part of its unique mechanism of action. Anyway, so low carb kind of Mediterranean style diet, I think, is a really suitable place for almost everyone to start, and then individualize based on their needs, whether they need to be dairy free or they don't tolerate eggs, or kind of whatever individualities need to happen there.
I love that. As you were going through that, first thing that came to my mind is we look at the blue zones. And for listeners, blue zones are the regions in the world where people are claimed to live or have lived longer than average. And if we look at the diets of many of these populations, they are exactly what you said, Mediterranean-based diets, very rich in olive oil. And particularly for cancer patients, one thing my mom and I recently discovered is that there's a component or phenolic compound in olive oil called oleocanthal that has major anti-cancer properties. So when you're shopping for olive oils that are high in that oleocanthal are very, very important, again, especially for cancer.
Oh, I love that. I'm going to have to look that up and read more about that. That's so cool. Yeah, I think everyone, it's like we should all, I tell folks, if you're going to eat a vegetable, it should be dripping in olive oil. Like basically your food is kind of an excuse to get olive oil into your body in some regards. Yeah. I love that you brought up the blue zones. I think the other thing that is so cool about the studies that are coming out about the blue zone folks, these folks that are living well past their hundreds, is their nutrition and their community. So they're all eating similarly, these sort of anti-inflammatory style diets. And a lot of them are living in these communities that have these close-knit, long-standing relationships. And I think that's really important for humans.
Couldn't agree more. I've read some interesting opinions on this next question that I have for you, with the premise being that cancer cells, for example, thrive in acidity, but not in alkalinity. Therefore, patients should adopt a diet that's more favorable to creating that alkaline environment. So is the Mediterranean diet, in fact, probably one of the best ones to promote that alkaline environment? And how does that impact our internal terrain?
It is, that's such a great question. And there's still a lot, I don't know that there's necessarily controversy, but when we talk about alkaline diets, I don't know how much, let me get my words together.
There's so many different opinions on this. So that's why I'm just curious what your take is.
I don't know that what we're eating, I don't know how much we're actually going to be able to shift our physiologic pH with our nutrition. Just because our body has all these built-in buffering systems and layers and layers and layers, and likes to keep our physiologic pH in a really tight, narrow range. That being said, alkaline diets are generally fabulous diets, right? They're high in leafy greens, they're low in sugar, they're low in processed foods, they're high in healthy fats. So if anyone has ever come to me and said like, hey, I'm thinking about, I want to experiment eating this more alkaline diet, my response is always like, I don't know how much that's actually going to shift the alkalinity of your body. It probably won't do much, but I love that diet for all these other reasons. So let's go for it. The one area I do kind of slow folks down is I'm not crazy about alkaline drinking water. Because again, we need our stomach to be acidic. And so it's like, why would we be drinking? It would be effectively, in my mind, drinking like a little bit of baking soda and water all the time. And especially like as we're going to eat, you don't want to neutralize your stomach acid. So I have folks stay away from the alkaline waters. If anything, I don't think they're doing anything except kind of maybe inhibiting digestion a little bit.
That's very important.
Yeah. What I think is the most important in terms of, we do have these ideas of acidity versus alkalinity in these tumor microenvironments. And what is really driving that acidity is the release of lactic acid from this really enhanced metabolic division. Cancer cells their metabolism can be up to 400 times that of a normal, healthy, regular cell. So, instead of trying to adjust the pH around those tumor microenvironments with something we're doing nutritionally, I'd rather try to stabilize that patient's blood sugar, and so that there's just not that much blood sugar around for those cancer cells to be going crazy with. And so we would do that exactly kind of like we mentioned with like a low carb or a ketogenic style diet, so that the healthy cells are getting all the nutrition they need, but the unhealthy cells don't have that excess around.
I love that. And question for you too, just on that note, I've heard, I mean, cancer cells are so smart, right? So once you quote unquote like restrict access to glucose, they'll find alternative fuel sources. And I've heard that glutamine is like their second next best fuel source. So how do you address that?
Gorgeous question. Miss Jacqueline, you're up on this stuff. I love it. I love it. Okay.
We could talk for hours. I told you this.
No, I love this. So you're really good question. Glutamine can be a kind of secondary fuel source for our cancer cells. It's also glutamine, as we know, it's an amino acid. It's the most abundant amino acid in our bodies. Our brain can run on glutamine. Our gut uses a ton of glutamine. So this idea of trying to inhibit glutamine as a fuel source for cancer cells, if we try to do a no glutamine diet, we're literally going to starve, right? We can't. So what I do with my folks, especially kind of if they're going through active treatment, is I generally don't give my oncology patients supplemental additional glutamine. With caveats, if they're going through a treatment and they start developing, kind of the mouth ulcers, maybe from radiation, a glutamine swish and swallow is going to be really beautiful to calm down that oral mucosa. I will absolutely use it as targeted and as appropriate. But it's one of those things where I just say, like, it makes sense to me to not have excess layers of glutamine or excess amounts on board if we don't need it. With all of our cancer patients, we're always we're doing so many different layers and approaches for that individual. So I'm working to stabilize their blood sugar and not have those big blood sugar swings to fuel cancer cells. We're also going to try to stress out their cancer cells in a bunch of other ways, right? With our nutrients. If they're doing treatment with chemo and radiation, those are ways to directly stress out and kill those cancer cells. Fasting really stresses out cells, especially fasting, and then putting someone in a hyperbaric chamber really stresses out cancer cells. So I'm kind of thinking about all these other ways that I can stress out cancer cells and slow them down and make, in general, that patient, everything about them, make them inhospitable to cancer cells. Trying to restrict glutamine I haven't seen it be helpful. And then we just have so many other good areas to kind of work with and approach that I generally I haven't been paying too much attention to the glutamine restriction stuff, because I think it's a little tricky.
Yeah, I'm on board with you there. Again, I just read so much and I hear all these different opinions. So I'm always trying to parse through, okay, what's accurate and what's not. Wonderful. Well, I want to be conscious of your time. We have covered so much. I'm so excited for future episodes with you, even just to specifically discuss the cancer patient and optimal nutrition for them, because that is a whole other field. I'll end with one question for you. What does being well and strong mean to you?
Oh, gosh, being well and strong. To me, for me personally, being well and strong is, I feel my best when I'm well rested and I've been eating well nutritionally. So when I feel well nourished and when I've had a good rest, a good night's sleep, that's kind of when I feel my best. And I encourage, I think patients, again, sleep and nutrition are so foundational. We're really good about paying attention to needing to exercise or needing to move or needing to be active and needing to kind of be engaged. But I don't think we're great about paying attention to how we all rest. So that's an area that I really like to kind of pay attention to with myself and remind folks, But let me think. When I think of Well and Strong for kind of patients as a patient population, in my mind, that is health freedom for patients. That's that they have the capabilities in their body to be doing the things they want to do, regardless of what it is, right? So, playing with grandkids or traveling or spending time in their garden. I think Well and Strong is making sure that folks have the physical health to be able to pursue kind of what makes them happy. So,
Beautiful
yeah.
response. Well, thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate everything you do. So thank you.
Oh my gosh, Miss Jacqueline, huge hugs to you. I can't wait to meet you in person one of these days.
I would
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. Stay in touch. And this has been just wonderful. Thank you so much.
You can find Dr. Lauren Mathewson on her Instagram at Dr. Lauren Mathewson or her website, Northern California Naturopathic, norcalnd.com. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you would like to support the show, please subscribe, leave a rating, and share it with others. Be sure to visit WellnStrong.com to access notes from the show and to stay current with new content. I'm so grateful you joined me. Be well and be strong.